again, speaking in very broad generalities, what are some of the dangers that are faced, I suppose, particularly by women, maybe particularly young girls living in these more perhaps extreme versions of Islamic culture? Again, a broad question, but Adam, how can you maybe help us better understand some of the dangers that Islam poses here?
I can give you one very good example that is dear to my heart. For instance, specifically when it comes to young women, female genital mutilation.
Mm-hmm.
It is praised, but even though I have to say it is not clearly mentioned in the Quran, but it is mentioned in the Hadith. So it is praised or promoted by the Prophet's sayings. And again, it is one of those things that it depends which part of the world you come from. So it's still practiced in Upper Egypt till today. And the reason it is dear to my heart is because my mom suffered from that growing up, even though I came from a Christian background, Christian family, but they were living in a heavily Muslim populated area. And this is when the line gets so blurred. When religious dogma is heavily practiced, it becomes a societal tradition. So even a Christian family put their young daughter into female genital mutilation because that's the right thing to do. Um, Now, my mom had uh, five sisters. They all experienced female genital mutilation, but one. And that shows what young women go through in these areas, in these countries, when just religion tells you what we should do by each other and each other's bodies. And yeah,
Oof.
I can talk about female genital mutilation in a completely different uh, in another video or in another interview, but it's a big one.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that's definitely a important conversation for us to be having. I don't think that most folks listening would realize how common that is now and today here in America, let alone in some of the other parts of the world.
If you want some numbers, let me tell you that in Egypt, and again, that's just one number because I'm familiar with, we're talking about 40% of women between the age of 19 to 50 today, those living women, um, they experience 40% of these women experience female genital mutilation.
Oof.
40%. Of course, they had the procedure done to them at a much younger age, but they are still suffering both sexually and physiologically, and a lot of other trouble that happens from that through their lives. But yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a heavy topic, and you're right. We probably could do a whole entire episode about genital mutilation,
Yeah.
female and male and other, um, which is definitely a topic to discuss. I'm kind of reminded by your comments of okay, here I go into another book. I'm sorry, but I'm thinking of an ethnographer, Laila Abulugad, who is, I believe, she is also Egyptian and has written on women in Bedouin communities in Egypt and kind of touched on some of the same concepts that you were mentioning. I'm thinking about in one of her books called Writing Women's Worlds. She brings up the similar concept you did about how even in areas that are perhaps not very traditionally or traditional in their religious beliefs, or perhaps not so strict about them, over time, the societal attitudes may have shifted such that those traditions or strictures and rules for people have become not even just a religious prohibition, but just something that you can't avoid because it's socially or politically become sort of forced onto people. And so I'm wondering if you have any further comments on kind of to what extent are some of these things specifically religious in nature, or to what extent are they bound up with political and economic and social factors? How complex is this problem?
Super complex. in a way that the line is completely blurry. In some cases, you cannot really trace it down whether it started with religion or it was something that was existent and religion embraced that practice. Um, for circumcision has, as far as we know, preceded religion. So we know that the ancient Egyptians were the first to practice circumcision on males, and perhaps that's how it went to Judaism, and from there Christianity and Islam. And but we also know that African tribes, they also practice uh, circumcision for male and female genital mutilation with no religious for no religious reasons. That it's actually a tradition, an African tradition in these uh, old tribes. So yeah, I as I said, it's hard to trace sometimes which one is which.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's a difficult question for
But
sure.
the most awful thing, it's a side note because it's not really on the religion part. But in most areas where these practices are happening, it's not even done in a clinical, in a clean, hygienic way
Sure.
where you
Yeah.
take the female or the male to the doctor to have this done. In a lot of cases, you actually take them to just a person down the street who just grabs a blade and cuts off, and a lot of people get infection and bleed to death. And yeah, it's not
Some of
done by a doctor.
Yeah, and some of the stories I've heard can be remarkably graphic and upsetting, and are certainly, I think, worthy of our time and our thought, and frankly, like our effort and our political will. Part of me wants to ask, like, is it better to have it be this sort of like back alley thing versus something that is institutionalized and sort of assumed for every infant, the way that circumcision is? That's certainly not a fair equivalency, even if it is a comparison, but it is terribly upsetting to recognize just the real dangers that exist here.
Totally. And the legalization or the putting an authority, you know that number I said earlier, 40% of the women in Egypt between those ages are experienced mutilation. However, legally, female genital mutilation is illegal in Egypt.
Mm,
So you would be arrested if you are a doctor who practiced that. Yet 40% of women still practice it. So that also, Kira, gives you an idea of the, the, the societal pressures. Even though it's illegal, people still practice it heavily.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a tricky problem too, because, kind of to Christie's point, on the one hand, we're introducing this, extreme danger to people who are having these done, behind the scenes, but also, if let me know if I'm understanding this correctly. I know some versions of female genital mutilation, if they were to be performed by a doctor, would, I mean, they cause medical harm and bodily harm that may be irreparable in some cases. Is that correct? It's
mhm.
not necessarily analogous to male genital mutilation, although I think in some cases it may be closer to that than in others. Would that be a correct characterization?
I would say so, yes, but it's a little out of my depth, so I don't want to confirm 100%.